no numbers, there's no pictures, there's no videos, there's no gameplay. I don't like it.
Yo, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Hope you guys are doing well. Hope everyone's having a good day so far. Today, we're going to get back into Sunrise Stories. Today, we're going to be going over Alteration. So, this was actually a story someone told me to write. I think it was when I was still in the Free Home Sunrise Discord. It was like around the time where like we were talking about these, like we were talking about something to do with items in the game. And they were like, yo, I dare you to write a story about this. And I was like, okay, bet, I'll do it. So this is what that story is going to be about. I'm not going to give any context at all. We're just going to go into it. It was just someone told me to write this story, and I was like, I'm going to do it. I'm going to make it work. And I did. So let's get into Alteration. You ever have that one day where you felt like anything was possible? Well, for me and my two friends, that day was today. As close as we were, we lived in different parts of the Grove. The first person I ever met in Sacred Grove was Calvin Coldcastle. He lived in Snow Hill and loved the snowball fights that went on. Then, there... Comma? Hello? I'm gonna put a comma there, because it feels wrong not to have a comma there. That just looks... It looks weird. Then, there was Morgan Webfoot. She lived in Maryvale and loved the jump pads spread throughout Sacred Grove. And as for me, my name is Hank Highjump. I lived in Seaside. As ironic as my last name sounds, I do not like jump pads. What I loved the most was going to the beach and relaxing by a bonfire. As simple as it was, I had never felt more at peace. What brought me and my two friends together was our sense of adventure. It was the one thing that we did together whenever we'd hang out. It's also something that I would never trade for the world. Even if the world was coming to an end, I would cherish every moment that we spent together. So, there's these, like, three images towards... It's like these are the last TCG, like art that was made for like cards. These I think came out during the Sunstone Valley era, and these were like so different from all other TCG arts. It's like they were all meant to be together. So this is Hank, this is Calvin, and this is Morgan. This is Morgan. I believe they do actually have names. I believe. Let me just double check, you know. I could entirely be wrong. I will check like right now. Because again, they're like right at the end, so it's not like crazy hard to find. Well, unless, you know, I'm wrong. I could be wrong. Nature. This is what I get for like looking things up while I'm reading. I swear to dude, am I not gonna find this? Oh yeah, okay. So these are the actual names of these characters. Did not make them up, because I just saw one. These are the actual names of these characters, and I don't know. I wanted to have them all in their own story together because I feel like based on their TCG art images, they are, you know, they have some connection to each other. So yeah, let's keep going. One day, I discovered an item that I had never seen before and wanted to share my discovery with my friends. I gave them a call and asked them to come down to Seaside as soon as they could. It only took a couple of hours, but they were here and ready for adventure. I gave Calvin and Morgan each a high five and said, "Wait until you guys see what I found. It's gonna blow your minds." They were confused, but still excited regardless. I took them down to the beach and picked up the rare find. So, this is kind of what the whole story is about. Someone wanted me to write a story based on, like, origins of some of the objects in TCG, and this whole story is going to be related, revolving around the shuffle shooter. So, there's some context. Let's keep going, and I'll explain more. Calvin looked at it and asked, "The heck is that?" Morgan studied it and said, "Looks like one of those blasters from those Western films my dad used to show me." I pointed at the trigger and said, "I tried firing it, but no dice. I think it's broken." Calvin shook his head and said, "What's broken can be fixed. I say we should head on over to Sunstone Valley for repair." Morgan looked at him and asked, "You know someone who can fix it over yonder?" I forgot I wrote Morgan as, you know, she's a Southern girl, so she talks like this, brother. Keep going. He nodded and said, "He's a nice guy, knows his way knows his way around any contraption. I thought for a moment and asked, I find it hard to believe you'd go to the hottest place in Sacred Grove, considering you live in Snow Hill. Why travel over there? He shrugged and said, I wanted to get out of my comfort zone. Turns out it was a phenomenal idea, and I met some nice people there. Morgan smiled and said, good enough for me. Let's go explore. We left Seaside and headed on over to Sunstone Valley to see if we could actually repair this thing. Calvin led us to an old workshop in a cavern. It was abandoned by the looks of it. I scratched my head and asked, Calvin, you sure your friend still works here? He nodded and said, positive. Trust me, it was empty when I stopped by a couple times too. Morgan chuckled and said, whatever you say, Cal, but this is a small cave. It's not like there's a place to hide. As soon as she said that, a secret door below the workshop opened out, and out came a dwarf. He looked at us, then at Calvin, and said, Calvin, you brought friends! You should have told me. I would have made snacks. He laughed and said, sorry for the short notice, but we need your help with something we found. I handed him the blaster, and he put it on his goggles to inspect it. He gasped and said, what you found is something of extraordinary power. Let's get to work. So there is actually art for the shuffle shooter other than that image that I found. Because the shuffle shooter was an item you could get from TCG. You could actually just, like, there's a bunch of items. I have, like, a whole folder of, like, pictures of items you could have gotten from TCG as a reward. You could get a lot. There was a ton you could get. So, yeah, let's keep going. We watched as he tinkered with the device. Not only was he fixing the blaster, but he was also creating things to put into the cartridge. When he finally finished, he let out a sigh and said, I'm going to miss working on you, little fella. He picked up the blaster and handed it to me, then said, the weapon works properly now. I've made some changes to the blaster. Now it fires the rounds that I created. Morgan looked at it and asked, what do the rounds do? He shrugged and said, wish I could tell you, but that would spoil the fun. I'm only joking. I actually have no idea what they do. Calvin laughed and said, good one, Nog. He gasped and said, that reminds me, I never told you my name. I go by Noggle Cogloose around these parts, but my friends call me Nog. Any friend of Calvin here is a friend of mine. I smiled and said, happy to have more friends in Sacred Grove. Nog nodded and said, one last thing before you go testing that thing. In case anyone asks you what it's called, I named it Shuffle Shooter. Don't want you kids getting in any sorts of trouble. Morgan nodded and said, good to know, and thank you for helping us out. He shrugged and said, no worries, happy to help. I'll see you all when I see you. We left the workshop and Calvin said, told you to, super nice guy. I chuckled and said, he's like a lot of people in Sacred Grove, but he's a genius if anything else. Morgan looked at the shuffle shooter and asked, well, if we're going to test it, where should we start? I looked at the purple round and said, let's head over to Snow Hill. Calvin did lead us to the guy who fixed this thing. He smiled and said, I like that idea. Wait until you guys meet the penguins. Nicest little guys around. Morgan giggled and whispered to me, he says that about everyone and everything. I laughed and said, most people from Snow Hill like to believe that, but it's not always true. We made our way to Snow Hill, and when we finally arrived to see the biggest snowball fight going down, Calvin cheered and said, man, this is one intense battle. I might have to stay and watch. Morgan cleared her throat and asked, Cal, aren't you forgetting something? He turned and said, oh, right, the Western Blaster. I laughed and said, it's called the Shuffle Shooter. Nog named it himself. Calvin walked us over to the penguin and said, look how nice they are. I wish I could have one as a pet. Morgan chuckled and asked, do you even know how to take care of a penguin? He shook his head and said, that's why I want one as a pet. Gotta learn somehow. Without warning, I aimed the shooter at both of the penguins with the purple round and fired. So, so the whole thing was, when someone asked me to write a story based around what we're talking about here, there's a bunch of images of, there's like different effects in game that can be used. There's like one where you can, I think you can actually enlarge heads and make them smaller. I don't know if someone actually managed to do that with the penguins, but the fact that there was an image out there of this just made me laugh. And like, I'm gonna have to include that in the story. And then there's other examples that I'm gonna show off here, but let's keep going. Both of their heads shrunk in an instant. I was shocked. Calvin screamed and asked, Hank, are you crazy? Those penguins were not ready for that. They were waddling around in confusion, and while I felt bad, we knew that what the purple round was capable of. Morgan laughed and said, Cal, you could just take one of those home with you. He shook his head and said, unfortunately, penguins aren't allowed as pets. The pet trainer thinks they should be free to slide in their bellies and eat fish. I chuckled and asked, is that really what they do all day? He shrugged and said, it's what I see them do all day, but who knows? Maybe they fight crime in their free time. Morgan smirked and asked, where to next? I looked at the rounds and saw the blue round, then said, let's head to Maryvale. Plenty of things to test over there. We made our way over, and while I would like to go to Seaside to try these rounds out, I think Morgan and Calvin appreciate them going to their homes to adventure. We finally arrived, and Morgan pointed to a ferry and said, let's taste the round out on him. I looked at her and asked, you want to use a round on a person? She nodded and said, not everyone in the Grove was nice, especially that fairy. So, originally I was going to write a story based on the fairies, but I didn't know what to write, and I don't even know if I'm going to write about them in the future, but, like, I did want to include them in some way, shape, or form, because in the comics, the fairies are actually, the villains in the comics in, like, one story, which is wild. Like the I think the top fairy is like a villain. So fairies are like seen as like villains in the comics, which is interesting. Like I almost want to write about them having a redemption arc, but I don't know. But yeah, I thought I'd include them in the story because, again, pointing out that, hey, fairies are not always nice. So yeah, let's keep going. I shrugged and aimed the shuffle shooter at the fairy and shot the round. When the round was released, the fairy disappeared. Calvin gasped and said, I can't believe you just did that. Hank, we're going to jail. I just know it. I shook my head and said, relax, Cal. I'm sure the fairy is around here somewhere. I walked over to where I shot and saw the fairy, then said, guys, get over here. You're going to want to see this. They both walked over and Calvin asked, you turned the fairy into a delectable sweet? I shrugged and said, I guess so. Now I really put a lot of thought into these rounds. Morgan grabbed the shuffle shooter for me and loaded the red round, then pulled the trigger. I looked at her and asked, is the fairy that bad? She nodded and said, the worst. Always on the jump pad when I want to use it. Calvin sighed and said, well, at least the red round was just another sweet. It could have been a lot worse. So yeah, they used both rounds at Maryvale. And again, like, this is what someone wanted me to write about. They wanted me, the penguin thing I just threw in there, but they also wanted me to write about, like, okay, so how did these guys with the little legs come about? And I'm just like, bet, I will write about this. I will make it work. And I did. So, yeah. Let's keep going. I chuckled and said, you're right about that. Now we've only got one last round to test. Morgan thought for a moment and said, why not test the last round in Briarwood? I heard a couple of people say there's a party going on over at Tanglewood Fortress. Calvin looked at her and asked, there's a party going on at the most dangerous place in Sacred Grove. She nodded and said, hey, those Chuggawa guards know how to throw a party, and besides, we'll be there and back before you know it. So, for those who don't know, if you've never played Free Realms, I'm going to explain it for you now. There were two locations that everyone would hang out at, and if you know, you know. Seaside was like more of a party place, but I guess Briarwood was the same, but there would be like, you know, you'd hang out at like the volleyball court and that at Seaside, and that would be like a party place. Now Briarwood, over at Tanglewood Fortress, everyone would like sit up at the entrance to the Tanglewood Fortress, and it'd be a party spot, but also people would trade there. I thought it was like a trading ground type of deal, but yeah, so I just wanted to throw that in there. So let's keep going. I laughed and said, you just want to go to a party for once in your Maryvale life. She crossed her arm and said, how dare you excuse me of one. I can't spell for anything, dude. I'm going to edit that real quick. You guys saw nothing, okay? There we go. Okay. Viewing. Nice. How dare you accuse me of one have a good time? I'll have you know that I'm a woman of science and want to experiment with the head shrinking, sweet making shuffle shooter. I smiled and said, sure you do, but we might as well test the last round out. We made our way to Briarwood, and it was quite the trek over. The fact that we had to go through a maze to get to Tanglewood Fort has got to mean this round for the shuffle shooter is important. When we made it to the fort, there was a party going on, but it was more of a gathering by the looks of the whole thing. Again, pointing out that it's not quite a party. It's also like a trading spot, but let's keep going. Morgan looked around and said, "This must be it, but we'll be testing the round on humans this time." Calvin looked nervous and said, "I hope Nog didn't put something deadly in that round." I loaded the green round into the blaster, aimed the shooter, and said, "Here goes nothing." I fired the shot and it hit every person in the vicinity. We walked over to the fort and saw the strangest alteration yet. So, including that title in Alteration. That's why it's called Alteration, because of what happens in the story. But yeah, again, the little dudes with legs. So this is actually what the shuffle shooter does in terms of like actual context. It turns everyone around into cards, and specifically the TCG element cards. So like you got order, you got machine, you got nature, you got chaos. So yeah, someone, again, I wrote this story. Bet. Like I did it. It's crazy. So yeah, let's keep going. I chuckled and said, "Out of everything I was guessing would happen, I didn't think we'd see trading cards." Calvin smiled and said, "I quite like this round, to be honest." Morgan shook her head and said, "I was hoping for more sweets, but it's not half bad." I nodded and said, "Well, I say we call it a day. Let's head back to Sunstone Valley." And to end the day, we stopped by what Calvin calls the Rumble Dome, a fighting arena of sorts. Morgan watched the fighters brawl and asked, Cal, why don't we have this back where we live?" He shrugged and said, "I suppose this is the Wild West in a way. People can do what they want here without having to worry about the Queen's rule." I scoffed and said, "So this is basically illegal. I think we should speak to whoever's in charge and make them get a permit." Morgan looked at me and said, "Hank, don't worry about it. It's not our business to get involved in, at least I think." She had a point, but I was curious to know who ran the Rumble Dome. A dwarf walked out from the back and I asked, "Excuse me, sir, may I have a word with you about the Rumble Dome?" He shrugged and asked, "Well, what about it?" I crossed my arms and said, "What you're doing here is illegal. You need a permit to run a place like this." He scoffed and said, "Kid, you're not even old enough to know what a permit is. This here is my pride and joy. They don't call me Rumble King Dom for nothing." That's his name, by the way. "Now get on out of here before I throw you in the dome." I stood my ground and said, "I'll tell the Queen about this place, then we'll see who's in charge." He smirked and said, "Tell you what, if you give me that blaster, I won't have to call my enforcer to take care of you and your friends." I laughed and said, "Do your worst, Rumble King. You're not getting my shuffle shooter, and we're not leaving anytime soon." He scoffed and went back inside the dome. I went back to my friend and said, "I think he's going to shut this place down. I could sense his fear." Calvin laughed and said, "I'm sure you could, buddy. I'm sure you could." Morgan yawned and said, "It's getting late. We should be heading home." I nodded and we made our way for the road. We were halfway out of Sunstone Valley when we saw a burly-looking figure in the distance. Calvin looked closely and asked, "Who could that be?" They got closer and revealed themselves. They said, "Carry on, citizens." He picked me up and threw me against a wall. Calvin gasped and asked, "Hank, are you okay?" I grumbled and said, "That really hurt. I think I'm going to stay down for a bit." The figure grabbed Morgan and Calvin, then threw them both to the ground. They crawled over to where I was at, and Morgan said, "Who is this guy?" I groaned and said, "Rumble King Don mentioned he'd be sending an enforcer after us if I saw the Queen. This must be him." He stepped out of the shadows and stood in the light, slowly walking towards us. Calvin shook and said, I can't die yet. I haven't gotten a penguin as a pet." I crossed my arms and said, "Really, Cal? That's what you're concerned about? A penguin as a pet? We got bigger problems here." So this was something, I did want to actually write about the enforcers, and I was trying to figure out how to do it, and I included it into the story that someone asked me to write. So, yeah, we're writing about the enforcers. I just thought, they gotta have their own story, right? There has to be some lore, So here it is. This is the lore for the enforcers. Morgan looked at the enforcers and said, Guys, if we don't make it out of this, I want you to know that I couldn't have asked for better friends to go on adventures with." We both smiled and looked back at the enforcer. With no way out, we accepted our fate and let the enforcer approach us. He was about to enforce when suddenly a more giant figure approached directly behind the enforcer. Calvin looked up and said, "Cactus Jake? What a small world. He lives on the other side of the valley." Morgan hit Cal on the arm and said, "Would have been nice to know you made friends with a cactus." I laughed and said, "Of all the things I expected to happen, it wasn't that. Cal, you've got a knack for making friends with people." So Cactus Jake is an actual character, and I was like, I gotta include this dude in somehow. This is just for what the story is about. This is a wacky story, okay? I will admit to that. It's a wacky, crazy story. So, let's keep going. He smiled and said, "Well, it is one of my better qualities." Cactus Jake raised his fist and punched the enforcer in the face so hard that it sent him flying across Sunstone Valley. Calvin waved and said, "Thank you, Cactus Jake." He growled at us and continued on his way. I scratched my head and asked, "I thought you said he was your friend." Calvin nodded and said, "He doesn't talk. He communicates in growling and staring." Morgan burst out laughing and said, "I cannot believe we got that lucky. This has to have been the best day ever." I smiled and said, "It's one I'm definitely going to remember for years to come." We got up from the ground and left Sunstone Valley. When we finally got to the crossroads, we said our goodbyes and went to our homes. I went back to Seaside and put the shuffle shooter on my shelf, knowing that I'll always remember the best part of myself. So that's the story. It's a wacky little adventure that these three kids go on, and I think it's a super weird. It's like I merged so much into the story, and it's the same thing with like the previous story, Separated. So yeah, that was Alteration. I hope you guys enjoyed the story. If you did, thank you for listening. If you enjoyed the video, thank you for watching. I appreciate it a ton, and I will see you guys in the next one. Bye.